Very good evening to one and all. I can see professors from all over India and from outside also have joined us this evening. It's going to be a very special evening as we have renowned Professor S.P. Mohanty from Cornell University, United States of America. So, as we have been arranging a series of lectures on Fakirmohan's writings and different aspects of Fakirmohan's writings. So, it's going to be a very special evening for all of us. And I again welcome you on behalf of Fakirmohan Foundation Odisha chapter. Uh, it's over to Rabinaran sir. It's over to Professor Ravindra Das for carrying on the agenda. Rabi sir, please take over and it's on you. Yeah.
सबको नमस्कार मु फकीर मोहन को द्वारा रचित गोटे गीत गाउछि गीतटीर नाम होछि अनंत मिलन कविताटीर नाम ईश्वर अनंत अनंत राज्य ईश्वर अनंत अनंत राज्य गगन अनंत अनंत राज्य मगन अनंत अनंत प्राणी संसार सांद एक कथा न जानी तुम्हे अनुक्षण मोहनी करे तु जीवनन्ते चालिबाकु हेब अनंत पथे मुहूर्त मिलन जहा संगरे बंधु बोले ताकू हर कोड़े न थाए चेतना पीछे दे दीने पुंजीव जातना पीछे दे दीने पुंजीव जातना अनंत राज्य अनंत प्राणी जानती जहा पासे अनंत द्रव्ये अनंत आधार चाई सकड़े हेबे एकाकार तही संदर्शन जानिब ताहा अनंत मिलन जानिब ताहा अनंत मिलन अनंत मिलन अनंत मिलन अनंत मिलन ओम तत्सत ओम तत्सत ओम तत्सत धन्यवाद ସମସ୍ତଙ୍କୁ ନମସ୍କାର ମ୍ୟାଡାମ ଟିକେ ଆପଣଙ୍କର ଇଏଟା ଟିକେ ମ୍ୟୁଟ କରିଦିଅନ୍ତୁ ଡିଷ୍ଟର୍ବ ହଉଛି ସମସ୍ତଙ୍କୁ ନମସ୍କାର ହଁ 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 ସମସ୍ତଙ୍କୁ ନମସ୍କାର ଏଇ ନଭସଞ୍ଚାରୀ କାର୍ଯ୍ୟକ୍ରମରେ ଭାରତ ଏବଂ ଭାରତ ବାହାରୁ ଯୋଗ ଦେଇଥିବା ସୁଧୀବୃନ୍ଦ ଗବେଷକ ଗବେଷିକା ଛାତ୍ରଛାତ୍ରୀ ଅଧ୍ୟାପକ ଅଧ୍ୟାପିକା ତଥା ଗୁଣୀଜ୍ଞାନୀ ମାନଙ୍କୁ ଫକୀରମୋହନ ଫାଉଣ୍ଡେସନ ନୂଆଦିଲ୍ଲୀ ଓଡ଼ିଶା ଶାଖା ତରଫରୁ ସ୍ୱାଗତ ତଥା ଅଭିନନ୍ଦନ ଆଜିର ଏଇ ୱେବ ଟକ୍ର ଆକର୍ଷଣର କେନ୍ଦ୍ରବିନ୍ଦୁ ହେଉଛନ୍ତି ଆମେରିକା ସ୍ଥିତ କର୍ଣ୍ଣେଲ ବିଶ୍ୱବିଦ୍ୟାଳୟର ପ୍ରଫେସର ମାନନୀୟ ସତ୍ୟପ୍ରକାଶ ମହାନ୍ତି ପ୍ରିୟ ସତ୍ୟ ପ୍ରକାଶ ଭାଇଙ୍କୁ ସ୍ୱାଗତ ଅଭିନନ୍ଦନ ଏବଂ ଶୁଭେଚ୍ଛା ତାଙ୍କ କଥନିକାର ଶୀର୍ଷକ ହେଉଛି ଏନକାଉଣ୍ଟରିଂ ଫକୀରମୋହନ 6 acres and a third colon on the way to becoming a competent reader. Reader response theory कहूची that text has no meaning until it is read by a reader who creates the meaning. Text ର ନାମ 6 ଗୁଣ୍ଠ ବା 6 acres and a third. ରିଡରଙ୍କ ନାମ ସତ୍ୟପ୍ରକାଶ ମହାନ୍ତି ଲେଖକଙ୍କର ନାମ ଫକୀରମୋହନ ସେନାପତି ଆୟୋଜକଙ୍କର ନାମ ଫକୀରମୋହନ ଫାଉଣ୍ଡେସନ ବ୍ୟାଖ୍ୟାନର ଆଭିପ୍ରାୟିକତା ହେଉଛି ଅର୍ଥ ଏବଂ ତାତ୍ପର୍ଯ୍ୟଗତ ଆକଳନ ଏ ଆକଳନ ଉପନିବେଶୀୟ ଆଧିପତ୍ୟ ଠାରୁ ଆରମ୍ଭ କରି ଉତ୍ତର ଉପନିବେଶୀୟ ସେନ୍ସ ଅଫ ସେଲ୍ଫ ଆଣ୍ଡ ଆଇଡେଣ୍ଟିଟି ପର୍ଯ୍ୟନ୍ତ ଡିସାଇଡେବିଲିଟି ଇନ୍ ମିନିଂ ରୁ ଆରମ୍ଭ କରି ଅନଡିସାଇଡେବିଲିଟି ଇନ୍ ମିନିଂ ପର୍ଯ୍ୟନ୍ତ ମୋନୋଫୋନିକ ଅଟରାନ୍ସ ରୁ ଆରମ୍ଭ କରି ପଲିଫୋନିକ ଅଟରାନ୍ସ ପର୍ଯ୍ୟନ୍ତ ଏବଂ ଆହୁରି ଅନେକ କିଛି ମହାବ୍ୟାଖ୍ୟାନ ବା ଡିସ୍କସ୍ ପ୍ରକ୍ରିୟାକୁ ଅଧିକ ପ୍ରାଞ୍ଜଳ ତଥା ବୋଧ୍ୟ କରିବା ପାଇଁ ସତ୍ୟ ପ୍ରକାଶ ଭାଇଙ୍କ ଅନୁରୋଧ କ୍ରମେ ଆମେ ତାଙ୍କର ଅନୁଦିତ ଯୋଉ 6 acres and a third ମାନେ ଫକୀରମୋହନଙ୍କ 6 ଗୁଣ୍ଠର ଅନୁବାଦ ତାର ଇଣ୍ଟ୍ରୋଡକ୍ସନ ଓଡ଼ିଆ ଏବଂ ଇଂରାଜୀ କୁ ବିଭିନ୍ନ ଗ୍ରୁପରେ ପୋଷ୍ଟ କରିଛୁ ଆଉ କାର୍ଯ୍ୟକ୍ରମଟା ଏଇଭଳି ଭାବରେ ବିଭାଜିତ ହେଇଛି ପ୍ରିଜାଇଡିଂ ଓଭର ଦ ମିଟିଂ and opening address Dr. Monica Das managing trustee ଏବଂ ଫକୀରମୋହନଙ୍କର ଗଣନାତୁଣୀ ତାପରେ ମାନନୀୟ ଚିଫ ସ୍ପିକର ସତ୍ୟ ପ୍ରକାଶ ମହାନ୍ତିଙ୍କର ବକ୍ତବ୍ୟ ତାପରେ ରହିଛି ଇଣ୍ଟରାକ୍ସନ and क्वेश्चन सेक्शन এইটাକୁ ডক্টর হিরণময়ী মিশ্র পরিচালনা করিবে এটা সত্যপ্রকাশ ভাইଙ୍କର ଯୋଉ ମାନେ ଟାଇମ କିଛି ଆମେ ରଖିନୁ ସେ ଯେତେ ସମୟ କହିପାରିବେ ତାଙ୍କ ପରେ ଏଇ ଇଣ୍ଟରାକ୍ସନ ଆଉ କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚନ ସେସନଟା ରହିଛି ତାପରେ ସମିଂ ଅପ୍ କରିବେ ଡକ୍ଟର ଦେବାଶିଷ ପତି ସେ ଇଂରାଜୀ ଅଧ୍ୟାପକ ଅଛନ୍ତି ଆହ୍ଲାବାଦ ୟୁନିଭର୍ସିଟିରେ ଏବଂ ଶେଷରେ ଭୋଟ ଅଫ ଥ୍ୟାଙ୍କ୍ସ ଦେବେ ଫକୀରମୋହନ ଅଟୋନୋମସ କଲେଜର ଡକ୍ଟର ସନ୍ତୋଷ କୁମାର ନାୟକ ବିଭାଗୀୟ ମୁଖ୍ୟ ଏବଂ ସଭା ସମାପ୍ତି ଘୋଷଣା କରିବେ ମନିକା ଦାସ ବର୍ତ୍ତମାନ ମୁଁ ମନିକା ମ୍ୟାଡମଙ୍କୁ ଅନୁରୋଧ କରୁଛି এই କାର୍ଯ୍ୟକ୍ରମକୁ ସେ ତ୍ୱରାନ୍ୱିତ କରେଇବେ ଏବଂ ଆଗକୁ ନେବେ ଏବଂ এই କାର୍ଯ୍ୟକ୍ରମକୁ ସୁଚାରୁ ରୂପେ ସଞ୍ଚାଳନ କରିବେ ଡକ୍ଟର ମନିକା ମ୍ୟାଡମ ନମସ୍କାର
ସମସ୍ତଙ୍କୁ ନମସ୍କାର और हार्दिक शुभेच्छा so without much ado we start off a very good evening am I audible to all
yes ma'am
a very good evening to all on behalf of Fakirmohan Foundation I wish to extend a very hearty welcome to all those who are here with us today. This session is part of the special lecture series on Vyasakavi Fakirmohan Senapati. What is also special is that we have with us today an extremely erudite scholar in the field of literature. He is Professor Satya Mohanty and is currently teaching at Cornell University, USA. We are indeed honored to have him for this session and we really look forward to much more than just a cerebral handling of Senapati's value-laden narratives. Professor Mohanty's bicultural background and his commitment to a vision of culture as a field of moral inquiry is something which has attracted attention of the academia in a big way. I think there's some disturbance somewhere. Somebody has to mute his or her microphone. So Professor Mohanty's bicultural background and his commitment to a vision of culture as a field of moral inquiry is something which has attracted the attention of the academia in a big way. I personally think his is a seminal contribution to this field of study. He has opened up vistas of deep insights into hitherto unknown ways of reading into narratives, especially concerning Vyasakavi Fakirmohan Senapati. His inner calling probably prompted him to institute a research project on minority studies, comparative literature, and cultural studies in USA. In fact, I would like to mention here that Professor Mohanty's proactive role in taking Fakir Mohan's works to the global literary arena is highly praiseworthy. His 6 Acres and a Third, published by Penguin, has opened the doors for inquiry into Fakir Mohan's brilliant creative writings. Professor Mohanty's field of inquiry is nothing short of a liberal education, which is the need of the hour from the perspective of the strife-torn world of today. Actually, when we make the aims of liberal education our compass, we build society's ability to creatively solve problems and forge a stronger community. In fact, Fakir Mohan Foundation's objective is also to reach out to the youth to help them become agents of change, to build a healthy society for peace and harmony. All the programs are centered around the youth to foster the ethical and social responsibility, sense of responsibility. Fakir Mohan Foundation has been carrying out various sensitization programs through workshops, seminars, direct interactions with students. And the unique thing about these is that we interface literature with the burning socio-economic issues, environmental issues, etc., gender issues, so as to make it receiver-friendly. So the interface is with the socio-economic issues and other issues are interfaced with literature. We take up a topic maybe from Fakir Mohan, maybe from some other great writer, and try to see the link between the issues that we are facing now currently, and what has been written long back, which has a relevance, the contemporary relevance. Coming back to Professor Mohanty, his ingenious approach helps to boost students' mental agility in understanding and decoding the various social roles of Fakir Mohan Senapati. Without further ado, I very warmly welcome Professor Satya Prakash Mohanty, who I am sure will hold our attention and accord a paradigm shift to the way trauma and attachment has been approached for serious study so far. We are grateful to him and thank him profusely for having accepted our invite. Over to Professor Mohanty.
Thank you, Dr. Monica Das, for your gracious introduction. Thank you to the Fakir. Can you all hear me? Just raise your hand if you can. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, sir. Yes, perfect.
Thank you. And Dr. Das, the unusual thing about this is that I see so many faces of old friends, people I know, but also people who are a bit intimidating because these are people who know Fakir Mohan better than anybody else in the world. Devinder Das, I just saw his image, the great Fakir Mohan scholar, obviously Monica Das, and Dipti Ranjan Patnaik, whom I saw earlier, but I can't, all the images are not appearing in front of me right now. Himanshu Mahapatra, old friends, but also people who are a bit intimidating for me because I'm talking about Fakir Mohan in front of them. I will try to keep this to 45 minutes, which is what I was told I should take, and I'll try not to go beyond that, maybe 45 or 50 minutes. But I wanted to say a few things that, may not seem, may seem like I'm coming at a slight angle to the novel, but let me start anyway. And I didn't want to read a paper because my experience of listening to papers is that we doze off 15 minutes into the event. But I think a conversation of this kind, where I will in fact learn a lot from the discussion that happens at the end, is preferable to just a paper that I could read. But I'm hoping what I have to say from my perspective will be of some value to all of you, not just people who read Fakir Mohan Chomanath Hunter in Odia, but also people who have read it in Hindi translation or English translation and so on. Let me put my cards on the table. I've been thinking about this novel for quite a while now, and I'll go into it in a minute. And I actually do think of this as the most important and the most interesting novel that India produced in the 19th century. And if it's read carefully, people will come to see that it's one of the most interesting and innovative novels, early novels in any language. And I say this even though I'm dead set against sort of praise of this kind for books. I'm a critic and a reader. I like to read carefully and closely. But I wanted to say that because I don't want this to be seen as a book about this great Odia novel. That would be limiting its scope. That just simply happens to be the case. And I wouldn't say that about the other novels by Fakir Mohan. I just mean this particular novel has a quality that is rare and has not been sufficiently appreciated. It has been, but not enough. So my first encounter with Chomanath Hunter was oral. I must have been, I don't know, 10 or 11. And in school, we were taught not Chomanath Hunter, but Lachama, which is a very different kind of novel, as you know. But at home, I remember my brother, who's an engineer, he was about 8 years older than me, would say, hey, sit down, let me read out this passage to you. And he would read it out and he would almost fall off the chair laughing. And he'd repeat the same thing and pick up another passage and do the same thing. So that was my first real encounter with Chomanath Hunter in Odia. He would read out little portions. But he had a phenomenal memory, which I don't have. So he would often, from memory, cite another passage, and maybe one or two words would be off, but he'd get it right. He just had a very good memory. Much later, after writing about it, teaching it, and so on, I came to realize how much orality influences this novel. And that is long after I had, or years after I had introduced the idea that we need to hear the voice of the touter in the narrator, the Odia touter, and I explained it in the introduction. It's a modification of the English tout, but it has a considerable amount of social meaning, and Fakir Mohan is mining it for all it's worth. Anyway, so that was the first encounter. I hadn't read the book then, and I wasn't going to read the book for quite a while because we were doing Lochama in my final, so 10th standard, I think, the 9th or 10th standard in school. Leap ahead to the time when I'm teaching at Cornell, maybe even 15 years, 20 years after I'd started teaching. I forget exactly when it was. I mean, I could calculate it, but, and the great writer Ananthamurthy, U.R. Ananthamurthy, was visiting my campus. And we had a small conference where people were presenting texts they were working on. And I had just started working on revising, kind of going line by line and revising and catching the tone of this the translation that the four of us did. The first draft was done by Ravi Shankar Mishra of Sambalpur University and Jatin Naik. And Jatin had shown me the thing. At that point, I didn't know Rabbabu at all. I hadn't met him. And I'll come back to that because he has an essay that everybody should look at if you haven't. It's not easily available, but it's that essay that actually showed me later how, what the spirit of this translation was, the first draft. Anyway, so I'd been working on it and I presented the first chapter. Ananthamurthy came up to me, introduced himself as if he needed an introduction, and said, it's my favorite novel. It's such an important novel, and I'm so glad you're doing this. Is a great translation. I said, several translations into English already exist. He said, I know, but it's the tone that this translation captures that I wanted to congratulate you for, the four of you. And that's when he went on to say, I've only read it in translation, but I've read different translations and I've heard other people talk about it. I've talked to people who know the Odia original because I had specific questions. And I think there are two foundational texts in the modern Indian novel. One would be this, Chawana Hunta, and the other one would be Gora. So I said, oh, wow, that's fascinating. What do you mean by that? And later on, he was doing a talk in the same week. He was doing a talk at Cornell where he talked about the difference, where he explained what he meant by that. And what he meant was, as he said, that Chaumana uses multiple registers of Odia, dialectal registers, in a way that doesn't happen in Rabindranath's Gora. We all know the history of it. It's the Shuddha Bengali that had become the dominant literary language. And he said, so for any writer writing in any Indian language, these are the two choices. Quite apart from anything having to do with the meanings of the text, these are the two things. This is the one basic question every writer will have to face. What kind of Telugu, what kind of Odia, what kind of Hindi will you use? So that had stayed with me. And the next thing was, remember, it wasn't published by Penguin. Penguin India is simply doing the Indian reprint. It was published by the University of California Press, which is kind of a coup of sorts because they had never published an Indian original text in translation before that. The editor, at that point, she's no longer with California, had just published something else about my work and having to do with not literature, but theory. And I called her up and I said, hey, we've got this incredible novel. I know it's a late 19th century novel. It's not something you would know, but would you take a look at it and see whether you'd be interested? Because you do have a series and occasionally you do publish Asian and world texts, primary texts. So I sent it to her. I said, look, this is the draft. It's not finalized, but I've finished working on the first 3 chapters and, there's a lot to do, but it's quite readable. Take a look. 2 weeks later, I get an email from her saying, I was reading this. University of California Press is in the state of California as you can imagine, in the US. And she was in Berkeley, which is where the press is. And she said, I took the manuscript. I was sitting in a bar in Berkeley and I was reading the manuscript. I started reading it and I got lost in it. And I was laughing so loudly that people kept staring at me. I just want to tell you that this is absolutely amazing. You finish it and we will definitely want to publish it. The only thing is, I don't want to do this as a book for other academics. I don't want you to translate it and then aim it for other academics. I want this to be a book for a world audience, for the world reader. And I said, what do you mean by that? He said, well, imagine somebody in Prague or in Amsterdam wanted to go to the beach and, for the summer and picking up a novel. Say, I want to read an Indian novel. I want them to open it and be able to feel comfortable in it. And she said, but that's just one aspect of the novel. I think it's funny. I think it's great. But there's a lot here that I don't fully understand. And I need you to write the introduction. I know your work, and I need you to write the introduction in such a way that it's not for other academics, even though it'll have new things. It's for anybody who wants to encounter the novel for the first time. I got to tell you, at that point, even though I had published, dozens of fairly complex essays and studies, this was the most difficult piece that I ever did personally. The most difficult for me. And the reason is very simple. We academics write for other academics. We write in a kind of a cryptic form. And here was a novel that, yes, I'm Odia. There are things I see as an Odia, but there are things I see because I'm a trained critic. I've learned from other people who have written about this novel and about Fakirmohan Senapati in general. But how do you explain some of those things to a world audience, to a reader who could be an 18-year-old in Amsterdam, as my editor said? And to write in a language that was both, easily, it wouldn't put people off, but at the same time would capture some of the complexities that I wanted to convey. So in that sense, I've been thinking about encountering encountering 6 acres and a third for a very long time. Because, the title of this talk, today's talk, because encountering, like my first encounter was an oral encounter, listening to my older brother kind of, laugh and fall off his chair, listening to hearing my editor in California saying, I was laughing so loudly that, people were staring at me. That had stayed with me, and I wanted some of that to be present in and available to any reader who picked it up. So I think that the first draft of the translation that Jatin Naik and Ravi Shankar Misra did provided the right foundation for this kind of thing, because there were many other many other English translations, but this one had a rhythm, almost an oral rhythm that sort of captured what I thought was essential. And basically what we were doing is going back. What I had to do was to go back line by line, word for word, and see if the basic ideas were being represented accurately. So that became a kind of a journey, and encountering the novel as a whole became something I was thinking about. I remember at that point saying to Anantamurthy, that same week that he was there, he said, you need to write more about our literature, about us, about Indian literature. And I said, well, look, the only reason I haven't done that is I want to be straightforward. I'm not a specialist in that. Was 15, 20 years ago. I don't specialize in this. I'm not somebody who has studied it as many people here have. And he said, and this is what I want to share with you, because this is Anantamurthy speaking, and I've heard Gopinath Mohanty say similar things and so on. He said, I read a piece that you wrote about Baden-Powell and Kipling. And do you remember those 2 paragraphs about Paraja, Gopinath Mohanty's Paraja? And I said, you know that? He said, yes. And you read it so carefully, and this is what I wanted to emphasize. He said, we need to be read with respect, meaning we need critics to write not generalities about us, but look at the sentences, look at the meanings, look at the complexities of paragraphs and images and what's going on. And we don't have enough of that. And that had always stayed with me. Here's this guy I looked up to, right? This is Anantamurthy after all. And I've been teaching Samskara for years before that. I taught Paraja for years. But here is somebody saying, our literature needs to be shown respect. And by which he as I said, meant just one thing. Our critics, our readers need to slow down and read us more carefully. Don't just call us great. Don't just say, this is a superb novel. Slow down. Well, I had to some extent done that because I wasn't writing about all of Paraja. This was just 1 or 2 paragraphs, and I had zeroed in one moment and modified the translation a bit because I noticed the translation in that moment didn't quite get it right. That had stayed with me, and that's when I started to write about it. So every time I felt like, well, you know, Devendra Das knows 1,000 times more than I ever will about Fakir Mohan Senapati, or, you know, Himanshu Mahapatra can read it with great acuity, and you know, what can I do? I kept in mind what he was saying. Write with respect for us, for our texts. Not for us, for our texts. And that basically has sort of guided me, without which I wouldn't have done this. So this was, it took a while for California to finally accept it, but this was their condition, that there should be an introduction, it should be aimed at a world audience, world reader, and not just fellow academics, and obviously not just other South Asians. I found that when I took that stance, that approach, some things became very clear to me, and that's the role of the narrator, the voice, the inimitable voice. But having said that, though, it would be easy to just hear it as a voice and not see what was going on. So I went back and read it several times. And the first thing that came to me, and I had started to teach it even before it was published, I would share the manuscript with my students, was that you don't read this novel at all if you've read it only once. You haven't read the novel at all. If you read it once, I don't care how smart you are, if you read it just once, you have not read this novel. Nobody does that the first time. We read the story, we think about, okay, this happens, then that happens, and that happens. And there's a story here. The real question is whether the story of this novel is the heart of the novel, or whether it's something else. It became very clear to me that it's that something else, and that had to do with that, what I'm calling the narrative voice or the narrative mode of this novel. Unfortunately, as we start to make this into a classic, at least in my limited experience in Odisha, we turn it into a kind of our discourse becomes overly serious. We turn it into a morality story. And I think there's a morality story there, but that's not the significant literary part of this novel. That's not where the originality of this novel lies. So if you encounter this novel and you're teaching this novel for the first time to a group of undergraduates, by the way, let me just take a little time out now and share with you the news that you know, there's a significant amount of work that has been done that I know I've been involved in pushing people to do and so on, and that's now available. And there's probably more in-depth analysis of 6 Acres and a Third now in English than there is of any other comparable novel in India. Take a look at the EPW, Economic and Political Weekly, the 4 essays that were published with an introduction by Harish Trivedi and me, and then the book, Colonialism, Modernity, Literature, that has come out since then, and there's any number of other things that other pieces that I haven't kept up with. But it's a significant amount, and what I'm saying is it's not just the volume of writing, it's the quality of the writing. Careful analysis of 6 Acres and a Third by people who don't know Oriya, so you know they only read the English at that particular translation of, say, 6 Acres and a Third and Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. 60 years divide the two novels, separate the two novels. 6 Acres and a Third is 1890s. Garcia Marquez writes about roughly 60, 70 years later. 6 Acres and a Third, Chawana Tugunta and Premchand's novel. Himanshu Mahapatra wrote that. Right. 6 Acres and a Third and Hemchandra Barua's work, which is unpublished but had a big influence on Senapati. And we need to know, scholars like you need to tell us what exactly Fakir Mohan had read, because there are lines that are taken from Hemchandra Barua. I mean, he borrowed a lot, like any great writers, and he modified. Devendra Das and Dipti Patnaik wrote a marvelous essay for that volume. G.N. Das wrote a marvelous essay. Paul Sawyer wrote an essay talking about Six Acres and Middlemarch, George Eliot's Middlemarch, which I remember reading in several drafts and thinking it was very illuminating. Paul Sawyer is a Victorian critic, Victorianist critic. And I remember asking him whether he would read this book after it had come out. And I said, I don't want to, he's a friend. I said, I don't want, he's now just retired from Cornell. I said, I don't want to, I admire your work. I don't want to influence your judgment, your decision about whether you want to write about it or not, but read this novel, see what you think. And he said, but I'm not a specialist in Indian literature. I said, I'm not asking you because you're a specialist. I'm asking you because you're one of the best readers of fiction that I know. So I still remember I was sitting in my bedroom on my the chair that I read in, and he phoned me. And he said, I finished reading the novel. I said, oh, so I'm waiting for him to tell me what his response was. And he doesn't say anything for full 2 to 3 minutes, silence at the other end. So I said to him, Paul, if you that's okay if you didn't like it, because it's not a novel that, just anyone can pick up and read. He said, no, Satya, I was stunned by this novel. That's why I'm silent. I don't know what to say to you because I'm stunned by this novel. So we got to talking. And I said, well, would you like to write about it? He says, I feel humbled by this novel. I don't know, what to say. And then he wrote this comparing Middlemarch and this novel, and there are different versions of it. First in EPW, Economic Political Weekly, Diacritics, and then this our volume, Colonialism, Modernity, and Literature. So I encourage people to read the essays that have been written, because my feeling is that you understand Fakir Mohan's Mohanty in English at least, 6 Acres and a Third, more deeply if you see it in tandem with comparable texts. They could be Middlemarch, they could be 100 Years of Solitude from Colombia and Latin America, or they could be Godan by Premchand. In other words, I guess what I'm saying, there's no way of saying it. I have to say it a little bluntly. Step outside of the history of Odia literature, which is what we often do in our literary studies. Oh, this is a great Gujarati novel, I'll read it in relation to other Gujarati texts. This is a great Bengali short story, I'll read it in relation to it. That's one part of it. But you'll do injustice to this, the originality of this book, if you only read it like that, or you read it primarily like that. So one thing that I wanted to kind of say, if you're encountering, if you have students that you're talking to, Delhi University, for instance, has just started making this a required text for English undergraduates in their 3rd year. And I was asking they asked me, some of the Delhi University faculty, I don't think there was a single Odia speaker there. They asked me to have a seminar with them about this novel. And I said, but English department, the English department I graduated from way back in the 70s, they would never have considered an Indian text. He said, no, this is new and this is, I said, so how many students read it? He said, any given year, 8,000 students will read 6 Acres and a Third. That particular translation. So tell us what to do. So I've been thinking about that as a context in which to talk about this. So if you have them, if somebody's encountering this novel for the first time, here's one idea. Have them go to the nearby village, the vegetable market, the hut. Have them talk to somebody who is not from their socioeconomic class, maybe an ordinary person, village peasant, who is there to buy some vegetables. And maybe you can then talk to the person selling the vegetables and find out about how much prices have gone up in just the last 2 to 3 months. You're talking about one little place in India. It could be Bhubaneswar, it could be Delhi, it could be, Nagpur, it could be any place. Find out what it is. And then step back a little bit, talk to the person selling it, and what you'll find is the incredible pain that people are going through. Prices have jumped dramatically, and we have no idea anywhere in the world what's going to happen. And if you get to talking, you will find out that it's not just the price of vegetables, it's all kinds of other things, like supply chain. There are things we would supposed to get that we're not sure we can get now. And then if you step back from that, you realize, so this kind of thing happens every now and then. Why is it happening now in this very dramatic way? Well, it's happening, as anybody would, can tell you, anybody reading the paper can tell you, partly because of the war, right? Russian invasion of Ukraine and things that's well documented. But what's not as well documented, although you can find accounts of it in the newspapers, is that it's not just the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it's also the fact that there's black market now. There are people in Paris, for instance, gas prices have gone up because they have bought up to speculate gas. In other words, decisions are being made at a much higher level. And I said Russian invasion of Ukraine, but Russian invasion of Ukraine didn't start with Russia. It starts with, years before that with NATO policies and, Cold War, post-Cold War, Cold War. So it's about something you can see at the grassroots level. When you go to the market and you see somebody saying, I don't know what to feed my kids. I can't buy onions. It's too expensive. Well, that's as concrete as it gets in relation to daily life. And you step back from that and you realize that somebody in Yemen is going through exactly the same thing. Somebody who 6 months ago was almost exactly like Bhogia and Satya, the two characters in 6 Acres, is now probably in a refugee camp because their life has been upended. So it's not just the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but Ukraine was the biggest producer of wheat, right? Which fed people all over. I mentioned Yemen, you can go to Turkey, richer country, you can go to Brazil, which is much more like India in terms of its economic might. And if you look at what's happening to ordinary people, it's exactly the same. Now, ordinary people are being affected on this level. Imagine if you couldn't buy enough food to feed your kids. Not necessarily because you've always been poor, that has been the case for many people, but because something has happened you don't fully understand and food isn't available. Onions are not available. Potatoes are not available. I mean, basic things. Rice is out of stock. What do you do? Right? But then connect it to bigger forces that we can't see unless we do some work. The war, policies, stuff like that. Well, okay, here's what it is. This is exactly the world that Fakir Mohan is writing about. The life of Bhogia and Satya is not appended because of Mangaraj. Yes, it is. I mean, he's the immediate cause of it. It's appended because of a process that starts in the latter part of the 18th century and continues through the early decades of the 19th century in Eastern India. That's a permanent settlement. And the permanent settlement is what converts land into a commodity. Now, this is the first thing to be explained to students of our generation, meaning students we teach now. What does it mean to land? Well, land's always been a commodity as long as they've lived and I've lived. But a major transformation is taking place. Major transformation is taking place or has taken place in Eastern India and in the rest of the country because of colonial policies. They have nothing to do with what Ramachandra Mangaraj controls, even though he's quite powerful in relation to Bhogia and Satya. So Fakir Mohan is writing about a world that is a lot like ours, as it turns out right now, because major transformations are happening in ordinary people's daily lives, which involves whether they can feed their kids or not, right? Massive amount of immiseration. But the forces that cause these things are hidden. You can look at them, but they're not something that Bhogia and Satya can necessarily see, or the person you talk to in the Siripur Hatta, which is where I go when I'm in Bhubaneswar, can necessarily see. And most of us actually don't see it because policy decisions are made somewhere else. Books have been written now about the famines of Bengal, Bihar, Odisha. They were not because there wasn't enough food. You know this, right? There was grain, there was rice right here. There were people starving a few yards from there. That's because of colonial policy. Right now, right in front of our eyes, Mungarajas are appearing every time you turn around. If you think that's an exaggeration, just go to the newspaper and take a look at how much Gautam Adani's wealth has increased in just the last 2-3 years. That's it. That's all you need to do. See how much it's increased. And it's almost historic. Even, I don't mean just within the Indian context. So that's Mangaraj, right? He suddenly becomes very wealthy. So all of this is to say, to read it simply as a morality tale is to misread this book. He's trying to show all of this. And the question is, how do you show all of this? How do you talk about all of this? Well, that's where the idea of the narrator comes in. So let me, before I go to that, let me tell you where in the novel we actually see some people who kind of know what's going on. Ram Lala buys the 6 acres and a third. He shows up, Palanki and this and that, Ghoda, Hathi, right? And the village people look at one another, and I'll read it first in Odia and then in English. One says to the other, Ghoda re, tote choro nobo. Actually, nobo no, nebo. Tote, not tote. Tote choro nebo. Na sethi dana pani. ଏଠି ଦାନା ପାଣି ଯେ ରାଜା ହେବ ତାର ପ୍ରଜା ହେବୁ ଆପଣା ଗଣ୍ଡାକ କିଏ ଛାଡ଼ିବ. And we translated that as basically a horse, so in other words, one horse talking to another horse, here comes another master. Why should you care? They don't care about us. You couldn't get food to eat back then with the previous master. You won't get food to eat now. It doesn't matter if it's Ramachandra Mangaraj or it's Ram Lala or somebody else. It'll always be the same thing. So from the view from below, ordinary people, as they do everywhere in the world, quite often have a clearer view. It's not about Mangaraj's moral qualities. Yeah, I mean, moral quality is important, but it's not just that, but it's about the way social inequality exists and functions in our societies. By the way, it's not just Odisha, it's not just India. Take a look at one of the great books that have been written in the last 40, 50 years, Weapons of the Weak, by James Scott, the anthropologist and political scientist, who writes about how ordinary peasants in the poorest of the poor in Malaysia resist, basically. All the things that we think were, oh, they're lazy, they're this, they're that, they're careless, well, are forms of resistance. And he says, well, that's the only way they can fight. They're weak, they can't fight back. That's essentially what the villagers here are saying. Why worry about this? Let's take care of our own interests. So to capture this, one of the things that he needs to do is to find a way of telling the story, a mode. And that, if we don't get that, that's the point I insist on. If we don't get that, we miss everything. And the mode is that of a storyteller. And I was calling it a voice, but it's not even a storyteller. The teller, where the telling itself becomes the thing that you need to pay attention to. And it's funny, and it's satirical, but it's creating a kind of reader, a kind of social being that he thinks you need to be in order to not only survive, but thrive in the world that has just been created, in the world that he's describing. I would imagine that that message, if it's read carefully, would be completely relevant to the times in which we live, with the Adanis and the Ambanis and the Modis dominating, taking over our world at a pace that we have never seen before. We, I mean, in India. You see similar things in other places, but the rapacity, the way in which they are seeking to control things and change things. Now, I used to take, when I was in Delhi as a student, I used to go to college from Bhubaneswar on train, and the student discount, it cost 25 rupees one way. Third class, 25 rupees. Third class, but sleeper class. I never ever imagined that our trains, our airports would be privatized. They're being privatized at a pace that was unthinkable just a few years ago. So Fakir Mohan would say, if you don't pay attention to those kinds of things, you have no idea what's going on in life, around you in a society. So that's the general backdrop. Specifically then, when we started, when I got this Jatin Naik brought the translation to me, and I kind of read it at that point. As I said, I hadn't met Ravi Shankar Mishra, who was the senior most of the four people who worked on this. And so it seemed like a great translation. The one thing that leapt out, and this is why it was interesting, very early on I was telling Monica Das this and Ravindra Das as well. Charitra, right? In first chapter, the word Charitra. And they are translated as character. Well, Charitra does mean character. But if you look at the context, it doesn't make any sense. So I said, no, this isn't, either this is a typo, meaning in the original Oriya, in the print, or because it's something else. It's like Charita, right? Buddha Charita, right? So, and if you then see what follows, just in those sentences, but also what follows later on, when he was born, these miracles happened and so on. He's basically satirically presenting Mangaraj as like a Buddha, like a saint. And there is a tradition in, so how do you convey that to a Western audience? Well, their tradition is lives of saints. So that's what we did. We changed the character to life of, the life of Ramachandra Mangaraj with a capital L, capital R, capital M, so on. Okay, so by the way, I won't stop to answer any questions right now, so please wait till the end. I know you're presenting things, but I can't do anything right now because I'll lose my train of thought and then it'll take much longer. So let's just wait for all the questions and the comments till after I'm done. Thanks. So that's the kind of thing that became part of this revision accuracy. The other thing that nobody, I think, had noticed at that point, and that was just a marvelous revelation. There's all these things where he's questioning authority, right? The authority of lawyers who know how to talk and run circles around you. The authority of texts, shastras, right? But there's moments where no footnote, nobody, I don't think anybody had written about this, where he's in fact explicitly referencing the Nyaya Shastra. Nyaya Shastra is ancient, 6th century, 5th century BC, and it's about rules of logic. So when he says, well, there's smoke, there's got to be fire, there's this, there's that, well, that's what he's referring to. So that playfulness, right, where all forms of authority being questioned are exactly what we see in this book, and that's what the narrator is all about. Much later, I came to realize that this is that sort of voicing, moving from one voice to another voice that happens in oral traditions like Pala, particularly the Odia Pala, where there's, you could be citing a classical, singing a classical song, but interpreting it in relation to something that's going on with the local Zamindar or the local king, right? And moving into something else, and somebody asks a question, you turn the meaning upside down. But it's that kind of thing that I think is going on. So what I'd like to do is to suggest then that we take a look at the first few lines of the novel, if you're teaching the novel, and see how easy it is to miss the kind of obvious messages that he's giving us. Now, the Nyaya Shastra is not obvious. Most of us don't see it because unless we know the Nyaya Shastra, right? But a lot of other stuff is very obvious, but we don't read it like that. So, okay, let's begin. I'm going to use the English translation, the 6 eggs and a third. And it's not different at all from the Odia. I mean, basic structure is more or less the same. And if you have the book, read along with it and see what you see. So the first line is, Ramachandra Mangaraj was a zamidar, a rural landlord. And the reason we put that in is because people wouldn't know what a zamidar is, and it's not enough to say it's a landlord. There's more going on, and you'll see that very soon. And a prominent money lender as well. Money lender is Mahajan, right? Think about the content, Mahajana. I mean, anywhere you go in India now, Mahajana is a money lender. But at some point, that semantic kind of inflation seemed to have happened where suddenly, why is he a Mahajana? Right? Maha maybe in the sense of power because he has money, but not Mahajana in the sense, like Mahatma and so on. But that's history, and that's what he's doing, is encoding it. Okay, though his transactions in grain far exceeded those in cash. Now you can pause here or not, but if you did pause, if he made you pause, you say, so why is he a zamidar and a money lender? And why, instead of lending money, was he lending grain? We don't know, but you start to pause, right? Very first sentence of the novel is throwing little signals, shooting little signals at us. Pause, slow down. Well, zamidar and moneylender are not the same, but at some point, the zamidar starts to become richer by controlling credit, right? Debt. For an area of 4 coasts around, no one else's business had much influence. Well, that one, definitely, if you start to pause that first sentence, that sentence seems like it's going to slip by you, but then you say, well, hold on a second, why is that? Maybe there's nothing. Maybe just no other zamindars around, no other money lenders around, and so on. Maybe, but you start, since it's the second sentence, you start, the doubts begin to pile up. He was a very pious man indeed. There are 24 Ekadasis in a year. Even if there had been 40 such holy days, he'd have observed every single one. Now, this is where a Western audience needs annotation. Now we're getting into this mode that is characteristic of this narrative, the touter mode, the exaggeration. You just have to know there cannot be 40 Ekadasis in a year. You see what I'm saying? But if you don't know what an Ekadasi is, then you wouldn't know that. But of course, a competent reader would know, or at least would find out, that here's a deliberate exaggeration. So his piety is not just that he does the 24 Ekadasis, but even if there were 40 Ekadasis, he'd do all of that. This is when we begin to encounter the narrator more and more and more clearly. The next sentence is, this is indisputable, and we're trying to capture that exaggerated, slightly humorous tone. In Odia, every Ekadasi he fasted, and then comes the thing about Jaga, who says this. Now it's getting more and more farcical. So the point is, if you didn't get the first sentence, you didn't get it from the second sentence, you didn't get it from the third sentence, I'm going to make it so farcical that I'm going to say, well, Mangaraj, how do we know that he, that he ate the stuff? It could have been mosquitoes, it could have been this, it could have been that. So this is almost like a kind of village performance, people with belly laughter, and people reveling and winking at one another because they're talking about somebody powerful. They seem like they're praising him, but in fact, they're doing the opposite. Well, the rest of the first chapter would follow in exactly the same way, where you couldn't, so you couldn't eat onions, blah, Manu, laws of Manu. Manu says this, and you can't do that, and so on. Now you're prepped for what's going on. So my suggestion is that we tell students and one another, we slow down and read the first few lines like this in order to what's going on, in order to get what's going on. And then, of course, these we see the miracles that accompanied his birth and his, and so on. And by then we don't know that Mangaraj is being laughed at, Mangaraj is being excoriated, then we're not reading the novel. Then we need to go back to the first sentence and start all over again. But the question is he just a critic? And that's what I addressed in my introduction. Is he just a critic? Is he just kind of, somebody showing this is how power works? Hey, he's a saint because he has a lot of money. And he's a lot of money because he stole from people last weekend. You see how people become saints? People become Mahajans in the ordinary sense of the word, meaning great people. Well, they acquire monetary power, fiscal power, political power, social power, and then we consider them to be great. So, but then the question, as I said, was, does he have alternative values? And I'm not going to go into that. I talked a little bit about it in the introduction, but I want to draw your attention to the fact that Ghodare, that line, oh horse, what does it matter? There's laced throughout the novel are lines of that kind, but the narrator just lets it slip. Banasura came and did this. But Banasura didn't come and do it himself, digging up the pond. He hired some mulias, the ordinary workers, to do it. Where have you heard that idea before? 19th century. This is the late 19th century. Labor produces value. If you take that idea, right, from the tradition of socialism, Feuerbach and then socialists, it's labor is the source of value, right? You see this novel has tons of lines, little places that are all asides, but he slips those in. The Chinese emperor did this, but he didn't do it himself. He just paid for it. Somebody else did it. Right? He's drawing attention to the ordinary people's labor, which produces social value. So who is this directed at? And that's where I'll end. And this is from the translation. And there was only one pond in Osarodiki. There's only one pond in Govindapur, and everyone in the village used it. It was fairly large, covering 10 to 12 batis, with banks 10 to 12 arm lengths high, and was known as the Osura Pond. In the middle, once stood 16 stone pillars on which lamps were lighted. We, the narrator says, we are unable to recount the true story of who had it dug or when. It said the demons, the Asuras, dug it themselves. Well, that could well be true. Could humans like us dig such an immense pond? Here's a brief history of the Osarodiki, the Osura Pond, as told to us by Ekadasya, the 95-year-old weaver. Remember, Tanti Buddhi is a whole thing about it. And serious scholars have mistaken that for him saying bad things about Tanti. He's actually saying bad things about us, not the weavers, right? But anyway, that's a major Odia historian misread those lines completely. Went on to think that Fakir Mohan was prejudiced against weavers. I mean, that's just the most outrageous reading possible. But anyway, the demon Banasura, this is Ekadasya story, the demon Banasura ordered that the pond be dug, but didn't pick up shovels and baskets to dig it himself. On his orders, a host of demons came one night and did the work. See, that same thing. He didn't do it himself. The man who gets credit didn't do it himself. It's ordinary people who he hires. On his orders, a host of demons came one night and did the work. But when day broke, it had not yet been completed. There was a gap of 12 to 14 arm lengths in the south bank, which had not been filled in. By now it was morning and the villagers were already up and about. Where could the demons go? They dug a tunnel connecting the pond to the banks of the river Ganga, escaped through it, bathed in the holy river, and then disappeared. This is all Ekadasiya's story, right? During the Bharani festival on the Ganga, the holy waters of the river used to gush through the tunnel into the ponds. The Ganga is connected to the pond. But as the villages became sinful, the river no longer did this. It's all Ekadasiya saying this. Now the narrator says, English-educated Babus, don't be too critical of our local historian, Ekadasiya Chandra. If you are, half of what Marshman and Todd have written will not survive the light of scrutiny. Marshman and Todd, as you all know, colonial historians writing about Rajasthan in particular, but Indian history, laced with all kinds of, some facts, but a lot of it is fanciful. He's basically saying, the Babus, you will believe something that comes from the colonial, the British, but you scoff at the ordinary local people who have their own stories. And you just need to know that these are stories and those are stories, and you need to look more carefully. Don't automatically scoff at Ekadasiya simply because he's dark-skinned, poor, a weaver, and from a village. Who is the Babu? The meaning of the word Babu has changed quite a bit. Now, everybody's a Babu. But if you look at the meaning, it's not just that word. Look at what he is doing in this novel. The critique is directed at a precise target. It's the kind of person Lord Macaulay thought colonial education needed to produce. You remember that famous line? Indian in color, but English in values and beliefs. This class who would learn to look down on Ekadasiya Chandra and learn to worship and be reverent towards Marshman and Todd and anything simply because of English. In other words, colonialist, right, in their values. These are the ones that this guy from not Calcutta or Delhi or Bombay, not one of the major metropolitan centers, but from a place that barely registered in the consciousness of the British. Balasore, Cuttack, right? Ancient cities, but that's not the point. From the colonial point of view, by the 19th century, these were devalued. He's saying something that goes to the heart of what Macaulay was trying to say the colonial system needed. So basically, to sum up, the question he raises for us today, if we read it in some of the ways that I suggested, drawing on any number of people who are here and who have written about these things, but formulated a little from an angle that I value. He's basically saying we need to be more alert, critical social beings who examine the values, the colonialist values that we've inherited. Now remember, it's not colonialist only in the sense that we worship the colonizing English, but also the Brahmin priest who he shows is just out to get you. Not every Brahmin priest, but the Brahmin priest is out to get you. But we need to be educated enough, we need to be alert enough to be secure in the values that we believe in because they're justified, and push back and analyze and critique the values that are imposed on us, and we accept them simply because they're aligned with social power. So power, values, beliefs, they come together. And that's what he wants to look at. But he's not just saying that we do a critique. He also has an alternative point of view. I'll point to one or two things and then end. I think it's true that the alternative point of view is very well expressed in what John Bolton calls the religious socialism Devinder Das and Dipti Patnaik have written about this, and they have a book coming out, which everybody should read, about the many different influences on the ideas that shape Fakir Mohan, which I'm now reading in manuscript. Absolutely fascinating book. But it's also the figure of, as many people have pointed out, Santani and Mukunda. Santani refuses to talk. Caught in this world where language is perverted to serve power, but not to illuminate things, she says, I will not speak. She doesn't say that, she just refuses to talk, the silent. And Mukunda too is silent. So, as people have pointed out, and I think it's absolutely accurate, they represent an earlier world, a little bit like the Bhagat Singh family. So that's one source. But the other source, as I said, is not just pre-capitalist, pre-permanent settlement. It's also a radically new idea that ordinary people produce value, produce social value, and that needs to be recognized. So it's this constellation of things that comes together. So when I was working on the translation, the first draft that was given to me, as I said, by Jatin Naik, I hadn't met Ravi Shankar Mishra, senior scholar at University of Sambalpur. And then later when I met him, I read a piece that he had written, and he must have written it around the time that they were doing the first draft. And I would strongly recommend that everybody go take a look at it. And it's called The Use of Language, Attitude to History Writing in an Early Odia Novel, Chomanath Winter. And it's published out of Tokyo. It's the proceedings of the 13th Congress of the International Comparative Literature Association, published in 1991. When I read that essay, after having read the draft, I said, these are the values, these are the ideas that have shaped that draft. And much later, when I worked on, when we were doing the footnotes, as you'll see from the book, he and I worked on the footnotes to the University of California / Penguin edition. Penguin reprinted the book that California had published. So take a look at that, and then take a look at these other things. My request, as just an ordinary reader of Fakir Mohan Senapati's novel, of this novel in particular, to all of you, specialists from various perspectives, we need to know much, much more at a scholarly level. We need to know, we need people who are doing who will do now the kind of work that Natarajan Sawantrai did. When he went, all he was doing, I interviewed him, he said, I'm putting together pieces, and here are the dates. They're all in the novel. And some of these things don't work, and some of these things, now, I don't agree with his overall interpretation of, like he moralizes the tale, but he got the facts right about the connection to that is in the 1830s, and the book is set. But what we need to know is, what did he read? Now, this revelation that Tilottama Mishra, the great Assamese writer, wrote a piece which is in this book that I mentioned, Colonialism, Modernity, Literature, Hemchandra Barua's unpublished book. Well, I don't know if he read Assamese, but it's Bengali script. By then, he knew Bengali, so it was the same script. So he may have read that. The other book that's interesting that many Western people just immediately say, when they read this book, they say, Castle Rackrent by Maria Edgeworth, the Irish writer, Anglo-Irish writer. It's a critique of, it's written a few decades before this novel, it's a critique of the Anglo-colonialism of Ireland, exploitation by landlords, and same kind of humor. Did he know that? Well, I don't know. I don't see any reference to it here. But 2 short pieces of Maria Edgeworth had been translated into Bengali, so he may have read it there. We know that he kind of drew, like Shakespeare did, he drew on a lot of different sources and then transformed them. So when I was talking to Tilottama Mishra, I said, well, this is interesting. These lines, they appear. And she said, yeah, but look at what he does. He's magnificent. Hemchandra Barua doesn't manage that. So let's forget about originality. Let's think about this creative transmutation that's going on. And the transmutation can only make sense. We see it as happening on this continuum, which starts with orality, the I'm suggesting Pala, but it could be other things too, right? Satirical traditions, all the way up to the great Sanskrit texts that he clearly knew. And I mean, here's a man who's citing the Nyaya Shastra and doesn't even tell us he's doing that, right? He doesn't say the Nyaya Shastra says. He just, there are passages that are clearly from the Nyaya Shastra, the great classical treatises on reasoning and logic. And of course, what he's doing is using logic to subvert the logical discourse of the powerful. So that's where I want to end. And I would really love to hear what people have to add to this, because you know much more than I do. And I'd be grateful for, just a general conversation. It doesn't have to be directed at me about what can be done. But I do think that we need scholarship of the kind that'll zero in on what exactly he read. He talks about a few things he's read in the autobiography, but I think that, for instance, is there any place anywhere where he talks about having read Hemchandra Barwa? Is there any place where he talks about, these two short pieces by Mariah Edgeworth that were translated into Bengali, and he read Bengali, right? By the way, one final thing, when we had this conference that Manoranjan Mohanty in Delhi and Harish Trivedi and so on had organized, and when they first invited me, I said, well, yeah, we could do it, but let's not do it on just this book. We should do it as a comparative kind of thing with other Indian texts. So that's what we ended up doing. And the wonderful papers, but one of the people who I still remember, but I've forgotten his name, he's a professor of Hindi at Delhi University. And he came in and he spoke in Hindi. And he said, I don't know Odia, so I looked at the English translation, but I went to the library and I found a Hindi translation. And he said, oh my God, Hindi captures the essence of this. Well, Hindi, as you know, right? All the dialectical registers are there. If you just go from Western Uttar Pradesh to Eastern Uttar Pradesh, you'll hear all the different dialects, right? And he was reading it out and he said, my God, there's so much depth. And all he did was just read a few lines in Hindi and he would comment on it. And I hope we recognize that you cannot capture this novel in Shuddha Odia or Shuddha Telugu or Shuddha Bengali or Shuddha English for that matter. You'll need those dialectic register. That's what he's doing. Why on earth did he say, Totte choro nebo? Why totte choro nebo? Well, the novel is full of these things. He wants the different accents and the different, totte is not something an upper caste, upper middle class person would say. Totte, maybe. Tomoku. Now, that's just one example because we started with that quote. So think about that for a second. I know that other writers like Gopinath Mohanty complained about one of the translations that had been done of his novel. And he said, you don't know a thing about how I write because you translate into Shuddha Bengali. And he said, I later found out that the person who did the translation was Rabindranath's secretary. So obviously it's that one dialect, the upper dialect, Shuddha, is what he was using. But the writers feel constrained by these things, or they feel that they can open up. So that's my kind of, as an outsider, my final offering, that please do some more of this research and consider whether what I'm saying about the relative lack of importance in the interpretive level of the moral fable and the much bigger thing that's going on at the level of social critique and sketching an alternative set of values, which draw on both Western and indigenous Indian ideas. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Brilliant. We are all speechless. Thank you so much, Professor Mohanty. I think most of us might here like to go back and be competent leaders, at least after your course now. So for me, I mean, personally, I'll definitely go back to the Hobbit again and try to be a competent leader and try to be, as you said, a lot critical social beings. We need to be that. So it's time for question and answer session. I'm sorry, we have only two questions here, and I'm sure when as Dr. Mohan would respond to these two questions, then questions will follow. The first question by Priyanka Palai. She asked that I can understand why it's why there's the measurement of a third. I mean the name about the name she's asking. Could you please explain why it's a third? 6 acres in the third.
There's some disturbance in the background. Please, someone.
Can you please?
Maybe please.
Mic is on. Yeah.
And I think yeah, Mr. Patnaik.
Dipti, could you put your mic on mute?
Yeah, that's better. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have two questions here in the chat box, and I think I'm sure questions will follow once Professor Mohanty starts responding. The first question is by Priyanka Palai. She wants to ask you. She can't understand why in the title it's like measurement of a third. Would you kindly explain why it's like 6 acres in a third? She wants to ask that.
Oh, sorry. Is that for me?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, Attagunta, I mean, again, it depends on, I remember asking people around then, it wasn't just my decision, but we wanted to make it a simple thing, but at the same time point to, Mana is not exactly an acre, it's roughly an acre. And Mana, it varies from district to district within Odisha, and obviously state to state, right? So we couldn't be that fussy in the title, right? And Attagunta is roughly a third, not exactly a third. So we wanted to just get across that. We wanted a title that would kind of point to the specificity of the land without getting so fussy that you can't have footnotes in the title, right? So I remember talking to people who were like an uncle of mine used to be a judge and knows quite a bit. He served in different parts of Odisha. And he started laughing. He said, well, Mana is an acre, but depending on where you are in Odisha. Right, so
yeah.
There's a certain amount of reduction that will need to happen in translation because you're translating for a very different kind of audience, and while precision is important, you have to decide where the precision is more important, where it's less, where it'll simply become fussy and seem overly scholarly. We wanted this novel to be read as a novel, and I think it succeeded. I should tell you one little thing that happened. I had given, after the novel came out, I had given it to a friend of mine who's a lawyer in the US. He's white American, not he's been to India but has no real connection with India. And he was going in for surgery after that, some appendix or something. And he said, I made the mistake of taking this novel with me because I hadn't read it at that point. And they were taking. And I came out of surgery and I was waking up and I started reading the novel. And I was laughing so loudly that the nurse came and took the book away. He said, no, you've got stitches. You can't be doing that. So do you see what I'm saying? You don't have to be a specialist in this area to be appreciating this. And I think at one level that's there. And we don't want the novel only to be read by people who know exactly what Mana is and Gunta is and Katak at that point. We also wanted to have that general import, because the book is, as I said at the very beginning, it's go to the Hatta right now, talk to some people, don't just buy things, talk to people of different socioeconomic classes, and then connect it to what's happening in what you're reading in the papers, and you will be able to see that that extended level is what he was addressing back then. And our world is in some ways going through a transformation that's not all that different from what Senapati was describing. By the way, it had already happened by his lifetime. He's describing something that happened in the 1820s and 30s. I mean, obviously continues through the 19th century, but he's writing at the end of the 19th century. So it's not his contemporary moment, but it's a profound transformation. And by the way, Shakespeare's King Lear is about a profound transformation. Balzac's novels are about a profound transformation in the 19th century. So there is history, but history in this particular way that you wouldn't get if you didn't pay attention to the narrator. So.
Yes, the next question is from Gitarani Bisoi. She wants to know what was the style of narration. Is it like a, I mean, I don't know, I'm not getting this question actually, but she asks that, is a parable of our times.
I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
What we can, yeah, I'm also at lost. I can't understand, but I'm taking the next question. It's from Tapan Panda. He wants to know what is this idea of transmutation that you mentioned a couple of times in your talk, and transmutation. I mean, yeah, and how does it fit into the structure of a state?
Yeah, that's not. There's no heavy esoteric theory there. I just mean a creative transformation, right? You hear a story from somewhere, and you take it to a different audience, and you don't repeat the story. You use the story, but you change it in new ways. And I'm suggesting that's kind of what he was doing when he took something from the poison tree, or from much more directly from the Assamese writer Hemchandra Barua, and then what he's doing with it. That's what Tilathur Misra was saying. He's saying, but look at how magnificently he's transformed it, because it's part of a whole new vision, right? So if you're a musician, you go hear a tune, you're driving in Sambalpur, you stop in some dhaba, you're eating, and you hear somebody playing something on the flute, right? It's a little folk tune, let's say, from there. You come back and you put together, but you transform it because you're putting it together in a different context, and maybe the tune itself goes through change. Mutation, transmutation, that's what it means. But there's nothing I'm saying here requires or implies an esoteric theory at all. It's simple.
The next question is from Kamalakanta Mohanty. He says, a little doubt about private ownership, which Dr. S.P. Mohanty seems to have disapproved, keeping Fakirmohan on the background. But Fakirmohan was not against capitalism, as he says, as the question is like that. In fact, he admired Madhusudan Das, who owned Utkal Tannery, and Odisha Artware, and Raja Vaikunthanath Dek, who was the landowner. So how can you say that Fakirmohan was against this? So how do you explain that?
I don't say Fakirmohan was against it at all. I'm just saying there is in this novel the idea that property is theft. If you take a look, and that's a great 19th century idea, kind of sweeping across the world. Take a look at that chapter of Bhagya and Sarya. How does that piece of land get to Bhagya and Sarya? See, we say, okay, they got stolen by Mangaraj, and they were stolen from such and such place, and that, all that, right? But how did Bhagya and Sarya get that land? Bhagya's father. How did he get it? Take a look at it, and you'll see Fakirmohan's real vision. So I'm not saying this is about Fakirmohan in general. I'm saying in this novel, there's this idea that, well, he got the land because he was a kind of a capitalist. He didn't weave himself. He used to be the middleman. That's in the novel. I didn't make that up. That's in that chapter. And when the land became available, he got the land. Well, why did it become available to him? Well, he had first dibs on it. Why did he have first dibs? Because he was the head man among the weavers, right? So it's subtle, but it's unmistakable. So I'm not making claims about Fakirmohan in general. He was complex, there's all sorts of things. He was conservative in many ways. And I'm not saying he was like religious socialism is an old tradition, but he was also religious. So there's all sorts of things going on there. I'm just talking about this novel, and we focus on that moment, Bhagya and Sarya. And that's a wonderful moment. And then, of course, laced throughout the novel are these ideas about how it's ordinary people who produce value, create value. Raja, certain such temple is named after so and so. Well, it's named after them because they gave the money. They didn't build it themselves. Who built it? Well, you can say that about any monument anywhere in the world. We don't know the names of the artists. We don't know the names of the craftspeople. And he's saying their labor is what needs to be honored. But this is not an original idea. It's not that he's saying it and nobody else has said it. The second half of the 19th century, but actually going back even to the early part of the 19th, full of ideas like this. Ordinariness of ordinary people is completely transformed in this vision.
Thank you. I think, yeah. And if anyone,
Madam, may I ask a question? May I ask a question to Prof. Mohanty,
Mr. Patra has a question.
Yes, please.
Okay, Professor Mohanty, could not the translators avoid translating the versified lines of Fakirmohan? Because you see in the characterization of Champa, or for that matter in that climactic chapter where that, that Barba, Govinda, jumped into the river only to be swallowed by the crocodile. The lines of the postman, the beautiful song, that is very famous in Odisha. The way the translators have translated them, you see, especially the chapter 23 lines I am referring to, it appears very mechanical and incoherent also, because you see the tone of those lines, the original lines and the translated ones. Even when you are translating, say, Champa's characterization, those lines appear so very mechanical. You see the onomatopoeia, the use of alliteration that Fakirmohan uses to telling effects are missing there. Hadn't they, couldn't they avoid it? Okay, leaving just the versified lines, limiting the prose lines only. Couldn't, sir?
Okay. You're right, and there are many things like that where we now go back and the translation could be improved significantly. I doubt very much that any press, either California or Penguin, will say right away. I mean, maybe they'll do it in 5-10 years because so many universities are using this as a text. Will say, do another revised translation. But back then, I should tell you that I wasn't sure that any Western press would publish this. And I wanted a major university press to publish it. So there are many things that are left there, half done, undone. I mean, there are lines we left out that I think I would bring back in. And that's simply the process. So I'm hoping that these are the kinds of things, not only should you point out, but maybe see what the translation could be. And that could be part of a collective effort. See how this could be redone. Now, some things we changed, some things we cut out because we just thought, a world reading audience would not be able to get it. And so we didn't want it to be too thick. But maybe we need a version that is, like a variorum edition, with all kinds of footnotes and so on, that would complement this. But this translation was meant to just get it out to the world. And I think the original vision, Ravi Shankar Misra's, which is captured in his own essay, the one I mentioned, is kept intact. And then when we came back and discovered the layers, like the Nyaya Shastra and the narrative and the Tauta and so on, those are interpretive things. I want to make a plea, though, and this is not just for this novel, but in general, in the Indian context. Anybody who's read things I've written and the interviews and stuff in various places that I've given knows this, but I'll repeat it anyway. We need more interpretations of our novels. And we need more cross-cultural, meaning cross-linguistic things. So it's quite possible that there's another novel in another language in India or somewhere else that is similar to Chawanatunda. And we need interpretations. We definitely need more of those things. But interpretation, by definition, are not the final word. You interpret something some way, you go deeper into it, and that's what Anantamurthy meant when he said, we need to be read with respect. And then somebody else can add something to it, just as Mr. Patra did about the translation of those lines. Well, we are in a communal enterprise. This is what's so nice about what we do as scholars and critics. That should be welcome. It's not the end of the world if somebody says, hey, you mistook this for it. Now, they may be right, they may be wrong. But that starts a dialogue. So that's just my generation of scholars with my own background, with my own values that I'm saying, but we need more interpretations. We should not let the difficulty of this moment of the text or that moment of the text stop us and say, well, when I know everything, I will interpret. I don't think that should be the approach. Himanshu Mahapatra had a question, but I've lost he sent it as a text, but I mean a chat message, but
No,
I don't know how to use.
Sir. It's just a long appreciation
Sir,
of your talk. If you will permit me, I can read it out. Professor Himanshu Mahapatra's message. It's like, I enjoyed your talk hugely, Bapi Bhai. I have no question as such. I've learned from your astute reading of the novel, especially the way you expanded our notion of Fakirmohan's realism to render it compatible with more postmodernism or even magical realism. Perhaps we can take it to mean that Fakirmohan teaches us to read postmodernism by going against its grain, and that's his supreme value in today's world. I have to go, but I just wanted to say my thought to you. That was from Professor Himanshu Mahapatra. But there is another question from Jagdish Behera, and he wants to know, sir, is Fakirmohan a feminist in Chamana attribute?
Well, I'm so glad that question was raised. That's often not, I mean, we haven't talked enough about it. So it's hard to read the Champa chapter, for instance, in the 20th or late 20th or the early 21st century and not cringe and think, oh, it is misogynistic. It's just the way it is describing Champa, and then later on the way Champa is described. So you don't know what to do with it. It's not just not feminist. Is he anti, right, women, right? The way in which, is that coming through? So first time I taught this novel in manuscript form at my university in the US, a young woman, white American woman who had no knowledge of Indian literature at all. She was an undergraduate, so she would have been like a junior at that point, maybe 21 years old. And she came to me and said, this is absolutely fascinating. And I said, oh, what do you mean? She said, no, his representation of women, absolutely fascinating. And I said, tell me what you mean by that. She said, well, you think he's being misogynistic, but look at how he's describing it, right? This kid's name is, I mean, she's a much older woman now, Claire Horan, Horan. And if you go to the EPW special issue that we did before that Delhi conference, or the book that I edited, Colonialism, Modernity, Literature, you'll find her essay. Well, it's just plain textual analysis, nothing else. So she doesn't know anything about Fakirmohan Senapati outside of that. She did a little bit of research, but she doesn't read Odia, doesn't know anything else. She just read it as a reader and a feminist. And she said, my God, this is, and I'm saying, and she, when she first, I said, do you want to write about it? She said, yeah, I want to write about it. So she wrote it as just a paper for my course, and then went through like 10 revisions and so on, because it was so new, that analysis, that I just wish everybody would share it with their students, have them read this and talk about it. I mean, there's a lot more that can be said about it, but I had never read anything like that. And to me, I mean, even though there I was, having written the introduction to the novel and teaching this novel, it took me aback. So there's great value in A, close reading, but B, sometimes an outsider's perspective. Meaning somebody who just comes to it without, with just, no great prejudices about what they will find. It's a bit like my colleague, Paul Sawyer, whose piece you can read there. One of the best essays I've read on 6 Acres. We said, I know nothing, Satya. I mean, I said, no, I just want you to read it and see what you think. You're one of the best readers I know. You're a Victorianist. He writes about the Victorian novel by training. So, and I told you what the response was. So anyway.
Yes.
May I put a question to Professor Mohanty? Thank you. In fact, I was waiting so long to congratulate you for the brilliant introduction that you wrote to the translated text. It was really wonderful. In a way, you were negotiating, between text as produced by the author and text as produced by the reader. very beautifully you have balanced the whole thing. Sir, today you are talking about that you often repeated Ghodare Tote Choronavo, etc. So don't you think this is it is a pointer to the recurrence of colonial pattern, whether you are politically colonized or so? I think it is a recurrence of colonial pattern. It is everywhere and it is always there, whether it is Ramchandra Lal or anybody else. And my second question is, sir, actually, you use the word competent only once throughout your presentation. I don't take it as a demerit in any way. But by competent reader, do you just mean the educated, the alert, critical readers, or academic readers mostly? But my submission is most of the literary classics survive on popular discourse. And critics come much later. The academic critics come much later to discover the other layers of meaning. But when the popular discourse is so powerful to allow a text to survive so long, are we in any mood to dismiss, I don't say dismiss exactly, to call those readers as incompetent by the parameters of competence that you have set for yourself, sir?
But you probably know from the examples I gave, I don't, by competent, I don't at all mean a traditional academic reader. In fact, it's a challenge to academic readers. So I began with this example of how I first encountered the book. I must have been 9 or 10, 11 years old. And my brother used to pull out passages and say, listen to this, and he'd almost fall off his chair laughing. So it's the oral dimension. Now that's very much in the novel, right? So if we start de-emphasizing those bits and only see it as this very high, serious moral fable, which often happens in the classroom, I think we are doing disservice to the novel. So, yes. So by competent, I don't mean academic versus non-academic. I just mean the kind of reader we need to be to see the kinds of things that are going on in the novel. So my one suggestion would be in exploring this idea, get a few people from, like the Fakir Mohan Foundation can do this, get a few people from different parts of Odisha. I know that 6 acres and a third was used by, I think, the Communist Party during the colonial times, maybe a little bit later, as a play that was performed and so on. But just get, let's say, a Pala Gayaka, right? The Odia Pala Gayaka, right? Not the, so the main person. And get somebody who is just a kid, you know, in school, and somebody else, and have them read just the first 2 paragraphs. Say, how would you read this? I don't mean read it to some, you know, superior sort of authority figure, but what do you hear? And see if they can see the voices. So take your time, read it several times, then come and share it with us. I think you'll discover the ways in which the voices, the many layerings of the voices, right? Just in the little bit that I read, when you look at the Odia, but also in the English, there's in the middle of a sentence, the voice is changing. So it's not, and again, in that line, it's totte, not totte, totte, right? And that's not an accident. He's doing that even when that's a quote. He's doing that even when it's not a quote. So it's these voices kind of weaving together that we need to become more alert to. And I don't think that the primary emphasis on the moral dimension of the story, that, you know, he's a bad man, he does this to Bhagya and Satya and so on, quite captures it. Or actually, I'll put it more bluntly, I think it gets in the way of our hearing what these different voices, because in the play of those voices and the play of those dialects as well, there's something central about the novel that is being displayed, that's being conveyed to us. I discovered this in, you know, I studied, did my undergraduate work in Delhi in English, and then I, you know, came to the States to do my PhD, and realized there was a big difference in the way lines were, you know, but from Shakespeare or something else, were being uttered by people, you know, back home in India where we never really heard that from an original English speaker, rarely heard that, and people for whom English was the first language. I'm not saying they were always right, but they were much more free. They heard many different things. And that's when I realized that what I'm hearing in Oriya, in the 6 acres, in the Chamana, shaped as it is by my history, right, which is hearing it as an oral thing and the laughter and so on, is probably something that would be completely missed by somebody who reads it just as this great text in, say, the West. And that's why it was so fascinating to me that that friend of mine, the lawyer friend I mentioned, who's post-surgery reading this book and laughing out so loud the nurse comes and takes the book away from him. He said, no, your stitches are going to come off if you do that. This is a bad book, let me take it away. Or my editor, right? Obviously trained reader, because she chooses books for the press. The way she started laughing, as she said herself, the people were staring at her in the bar in Berkeley. So you see, I'm trying to say that these are things we need to be able to pay attention to, and that's what I meant by competent. I think this is a novel that is still teaching us how to read it. Now, in saying that, I don't want to make the mistake of suggesting this is the only novel that does that. That's a line that was used first by, at least in my memory, about James Joyce's Ulysses. He wrote this novel, and we're still learning how to read it. Not because it's difficult, but because of these layers and so on. So Ulysses is a good novel to talk about. When you read it as this great classic in the English language, which we often do in India, well, we forget that he's Irish. And Irish English is very different from, say, London English. And I've heard people, Irish friends of mine, they read a line, and that's completely, I mean, it's laced with humor and all kinds of things that we just miss. And we say, oh, it's a great classic. Yeah, it's a classic, but there are also layers. And I just think that those are the kinds of things that should be retrieved and recovered. And by competent, and I don't mean reader response theory or anything like that. I just said, what does it mean to be a competent reader? What does it mean to be a competent judge of tennis? What does it mean to be a competent judge of an Odissi dance? Sometimes not knowing enough about Odissi may make you more humble and make you work harder. So I'm mentioning that because one of Gangadhar Pradhan's students, former student, the late Gangadhar Pradhan, who used to be with this group, in Bangalore, near Bangalore, I forget what it's called. They had the one that Pratima Bedi had started, right? Okay. And she had moved several years ago. I've seen her dance. She came to my university, she danced with another dancer. She's very good. You could tell that she's Gangadhar Pradhan was a very precise guru, very disciplined guru. And you could see that in the way she danced. So I talked to her a little bit. She then left and she's moved to New York City. I haven't seen her since then. But she has, because New York City is full of people experimenting with different kinds of dance. So she's built on Odissi and is doing things. And 3 or 4 days ago, she performed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is the great, with the museum. It's not just, and she with paintings and all kinds of things. And then the New York Times, like the most prestigious paper in the US and one of the most prestigious in the world, wrote a review. And you should read that review. You will be so thrilled with it. It's clear that the guy doesn't know Odissi the way, say, you might know. But the precision with which he goes and describes things, the way he says, this is what Odissi does, which other classical forms don't do. And then he goes into the way she moves her legs, in other words, her feet. So he's talking about all of those things because he's done some research, but he starts with the fact that I don't know. So I'm becoming a more competent viewer. And you can find it online, New York Times, Odissi, Satpathy, I forget for what Satpathy she is. And it's a modification of her training, right? She's been here like 3 or 4 years now, and she's done. But read the review, and you'll see what I mean by competence. You're moving towards competence, right? It's never an ideal reader, but you're moving towards that. And here it is an outsider. Now, he clearly knows other forms of dance. This is a white American man who knows other forms of dance, writes about dance, but he's getting into this thing. Now, compare that with any number of reviews of Odissi or Bharatanatyam or anything like that, or Kathak in our Indian newspapers. They're just generalities. Oh, she did this, the Pallavi was like this, and this was competently done, but that was, don't do that. Go into, write about it in a way that will make the dancer say, or the choreographer say, yes, that's what I was trying to get at. You're right, you captured that, right? That's the kind of thing Anantamurthy was trying to get at when he said, but we need people who will read us with respect. And read us with respect doesn't mean praise us to the skies. Pay attention, close attention. We desperately need more interpretation. We need more close readings of our texts. And that doesn't mean praising everything, but, and sometimes it means going outside of our traditions. And I read this and I want to compare it to this, not even though I don't know Malayalam, I want to read, maybe I'll, read a translation, but I'll then sit down with, and so the Hindi professor who read the Hindi translation and did this talk, and Monica will remember this, that was just brilliant. That was just brilliant. And I'm just saying,
was it Namvar Singh?
No. Namvar Singh also talked, but this is the guy who's a journalist. He has a column. He's a professor, but in Hindi, but he has a column, like a syndicated column in all kinds of Hindi newspapers. And we can find out his name. I mean, he's a professor there who was invited to talk. So Manoranjan Mohanty and Harish Trivedi would know him well.
I was there.
Yeah, I just remember thinking, and he read out a few lines in Hindi. And I said, Fakir Mohan would be thrilled with that. And here I am as a reader, thrilled with what that translation captured, but also what he was doing in dramatizing, right? Reading it out loud, to see what they look at this, and then he'd start laughing. He said, there's so much, it's not just humor, there's so much depth in the humor. But he's not just funny, right? It's depth in the humor that he's capturing the essence of a social formation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. If we are done with the questions and answers, is there any other questions? No. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for
somebody else had a question. They posted it as a comment, but I didn't keep it.
No, I have taken all the questions from the comment box.
Okay.
Yes, I've taken all the questions. Is there any question from the audience anymore? No. Then thank you very much, sir. Thank you for your valuable time, and indeed, thank you for your basic explanation of all the questions, responses to all the questions. And I now request Dr. Devasis Pati, Associate Professor of Allahabad University, to sum up the session. Dr. Devasis Pati.
Hiranmay, I have one thing to say. Since I'm there, I would just like to present a song. I'm there in Bahrain. I've joined from the beginning. I will, in case it is possible.
Do you have a question in Hindi, ma'am?
No, I don't have any question. I learned it. I just
we can end the song. Let's finish with the discussion.
Okay. I don't know whether I have connectivity or not. Okay.
Yeah. So it's over to Dr. Devasis Pati.
I think your microphone is off.
Please unmute yourself, Dr. Pati. Please unmute
Madam,
yourself.
yes. I hope I'm audible.
Dipti bhai tike kichi kohନ୍ତୁ. Dipti bhai. Tike Devasis tike gote minute khali please. Dipti bhai tike kohନ୍ତୁ kichi.
I just wanted to add 2 points about the things which Professor Mohanty told about Fakir Mohan's use of language. And this is what we are going to do in a book form. The attitude of Fakir Mohan towards Odia language has evolved over several years. Actually, initially, when he was a translator of Fakir Mohan, he was a purist, and he was using extremely Sanskritized language. But when he became a novelist, this language became polyphonous kind of language. And the Fakir Mohan, which we know, is a person who is using a language in its myriad forms. this I have dealt in the book which I am going to write, and Professor Mohanty is going through the manuscript. So he was very much against the kind of language which he uses in his novels in the beginning as a translator. And for that reason, he has criticized Sarala's Mahabharata. But later, when he started writing creative novels and short stories, he's using this multifaceted kind of language. This is one point I would like to add to this excellent talk. The reader, which the active reader about which Professor Mohanty had written in his talks. The second thing I wanted to tell is about the misfortune of a great writer like Fakir Mohan. Because actually, when you become a great writer, when you become a classic, nobody reads you. And in fact, because of the eminence of Chauman Attugunt, and which is a only phenomenon that got institutionalized after 1950. You'd be surprised to know that Chauman Attugunt, although it was very popular in when it was being serialized in the journal, the printed book form didn't sell for a very long time. It sold because of the popularity of Mamu. When Mamu was published, the reputation of Mamu actually made the first copies of Chauman Attugunt sell. And the initial critics hailed Mamu and Prashchita's better novels than Chauman Attugunt. But in 1950, after several writers joined in this discourse and Surendra Manti came up with his magisterial work on Fakir Mohan, then Chauman Attugunt became the #1 piece of Fakir Mohan's creative excellence. And after that, people have stopped reading other works of Fakir Mohan Senapati. And the people are saying that there is a popular discourse and so on and so forth. But to be very honest, Fakir Mohan's reputation rests on 4 short stories, a bowdlerized autobiography, and a portions of Chauman Attugunt. What Professor Mohanty was telling was very right in the sense, if you look at Devendra Das's notes in the text, you would find that for so many years, people are reading the novel without understanding the words that are there, and people never actually made the effort to understand the meaning of those words. And it was very, very superficial and impressionistic reading, which we normally do in Odisha. And our criticism is more based on adjectives rather than analysis. So this is what I wanted to add to Professor Mohanty's excellent talk tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diti bhai. Carry on, Devashish, please.
No, could I just say one thing before Professor Pati starts, and that is that, and this is very helpful, Dipti, what you said. By the way, I don't think this is just an Odia habit. I think in general, we need to read more deeply in Indian traditions. And that's the one big thing I noticed making the transition from Delhi University to the US. They read much more carefully. They have a tradition of close reading. Not every culture does, but it's one of those things. So I picked up and used in this new way the concept, social role of the touter. And I think that's absolutely right. It's the role he's playing. and the voices all come together if you keep that in mind. But I remember a young Jamaican student reading the manuscript, this is some years ago, and saying, oh, this is Anansi, And I said, what is Anansi? He said, in the Jamaican tradition, we have exactly this kind of character who does this. For Native Americans, there's a trickster figure, the coyote, who does something like this. If you go to the West, in Europe, there's the fool, whom you encounter in Shakespeare and other plays. But Shakespeare didn't invent the fool exists in ordinary culture. So the point I'm trying to make is that it's both specific, and the touter is kind of looked down on by middle-class people. Oh, he's just a touter. But the touter figure can be transmuted into something else, as on the term that I used earlier. But this is cross-cultural. Anandamurthy said to me, Satya, you call him a touter. Look at my samskara putta. Is that kind of figure? We all have that. I said, yes, that's the point. In Africa, in various African traditions, very rich oral traditions, very sort of vibrant in terms of social understanding, it's the signifying monkey. Henry Louis Gates wrote a book about that, a famous essay about that. But it's, he's African-American, he's drawing on some of the things that came from, but then that gets transmuted into like the Nancy figure in Jamaica and so on. The great Sanskritist, David Shulman, has a book on South Indian poetry and sort of folk writings. It's called King and the Clown. So with power, there's always, every culture has produced this accompanying figure who pokes fun. Remember, the fool in Shakespeare is not actually a fool. The fool in Shakespeare is wiser than the king, but it will say it in a way that seems kind of silly. Well, that's what the touter is. That's what Anansi is. And to go back to the earlier question of competent reading, until and unless we get that, we won't hear layers of what's being presented to us and what's there in the sounds, in the meanings. So anyway, I just wanted to add that to the excellent. By the way, as soon as Dipti Ranjan Patnaik and Devendra Das's book comes out, get it, because it'll do something that is absolutely essential right now. And I hope more people will go back to Bolton's book and take a look at it again. It was published in the early 90s. We need to go back to it and take a look. The one thing that I wanted to mention, and somebody could write to me later with the reference, Himanshu Mahapatra and Jatin Naik wrote this piece that I referred to, and that I've been developing it in different ways, about Lal Bihari Dey and Chauhan to the places where Chauhan actually transforms and critiques Lal Bihari Dey. But it's before them, there was an Odia critic who wrote about exactly that. He was the first person, I think it was the first person who wrote about it. Now, I found out about it, but I never really got to it. So if anybody has a reference and can even send me a PDF of that essay, I'd be grateful. It had been published a few years before Himanshu and Jatin Naik wrote this piece. They were drawing on the same material and probably the same analysis, but their piece appeared in English in this Canadian journal, and this essay that I'm referring to appeared in, I think somebody from Burhanpur, but I may be wrong about that. I mean, my memory may be faulty about that. So anyway, if you know the reference, please just drop me an email with that reference, and I can get the, even if you don't have a copy of the essay, I can get it somehow. So, I'm sorry, Professor Pati, it's needed to. It's kind of a feast, you have this opportunity to hear so many fascinating people that, everybody wants to be able to, and I can't resist jumping in. So please, sorry.
Fine, sir. Namaskar, esteemed Madam President, Monica Das, Madam. Esteemed Speaker, Professor Satya P. Mohanty, my dear friend, Dr. Rabindra Das from Shivharati, and all participating friends. I'm not sure whether I should be summing this discussion up because Professor Satya Mohanty has opened this up and this is still opening up. So rather than sum it up, I would like to add something to it in terms of opening it up further. So with the due permission from Madam President, let me honestly say that it would be very difficult on my part really to be summing up the entire discussion. All I can therefore do is add from my side a bit of opening it up further. I must thank Professor Mohanty for giving us today, during an answer to our query from Professor Abhinaran Das from Balaso, a different connotation of competent. I was actually thinking that I'm not really competent enough to sum it up today's discussion, this brilliant talk presented. Now I am feeling confident that I'm competent because not knowing enough is probably being the way to be competent. Thank you very much, sir, for giving us this brilliant connotation of being a competent reader, which I hope I now am. So I can be humble, I am, and I'll be trying hard to try to sum it up in a way, or rather open it up further. Yes, the talk was, the title has been fascinating for all of us. It's been a brilliant talk. It was encountering Fakir Mohan's 6 seconds and a third on the way to becoming a competent reader. And for me, I guess most of the participants would agree with me if I say that it was like encountering the process of translating a text to a world audience. And the way Professor Mohanty was explaining certain things, certain expressions, which have been translated for a world audience, not just for academics, and which would ensure what, as he has been repeatedly telling us, what your Anantamurthy would say, that they would like readers all over the world to read them with respect. And that's something that was kind of an encounter for all of us, to know what it is to translate a text, and probably would be was inkling enough for us ambitious translators as we are now. We would be looking forward to translating other texts in the future, God willing. That's one thing. And the other thing about Fakirmohan, may I add here, I have always had this opinion that for Fakirmohan, literature was not a luxury. I would just request Professor Mohanty to comment on my comment if he chooses to, if Madam President allows it. I always look upon the writings, the stories, for example, Revati, for example, classic story, and Chaman Attagunta, 6 seconds and a third. I think Fakirmohan was not a literateur for whom literature was a luxury. Literature was not just art for Fakirmohan, it was something else. What that something else is, I would not be using any word because that would limit it. I would certainly ask, if not now, maybe later, Professor Mohanty to speak on it, or maybe if I'm wrong, he might say it. For me, he was using this narrative form for something bigger. And that's something I don't think much criticism has been focused on. For me, as a reader of Fakirmohan's novels and stories, there are other examples also. Fakirmohan could just be one example. That literature for them pretends to be art. Literature was serious activism, and which is why we don't really quite relate the author with the man, which is what I guess Professor Mohanty was responding to during a question, somebody's question, that Fakirmohan was not exactly an anti-capitalist, as his novel Chaman Attagunta, 6 seconds and a third, is being read out to be by Professor Mohanty, and he was absolutely right. When we look at a text, we look at it as a text, and of course we take the author into consideration, but not certainly the man the author was, but the author that produced the text. And Fakir Mohan is certainly one of the rare writers who write because they must, not because they can or they could. On those little observations, I'd like to conclude my presentation today. Thank you all very much, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm humbled. Thank you. Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Devaki. Thank you. Thank you. Santosh, hello.
Yes, sir.
What are things?
Thank you, sir. Really, I would rather say, what a presentation. It is really a brilliant presentation we witnessed and heard today uh, in this you know, webinar entitled Encountering Fakir Mohan's 6 acres and a third on the way to becoming a competent reader. The talk was delivered by Professor Satya Mohanty of Cornell University, the United States of America. It was really a brilliant presentation indeed. I must thank him for his ideas which he really presented over here. And this is really an enlightening one. Uh, I think he has given importance on creative transmutation and he emphasized on the language and its cultural background while translating the piece, the classic piece of Fakir Mohan. And basically, he has focused on the reading techniques and efforts and consciousness in the narration of the novel. Uh, Fakir Mohan has, as Professor Pati had said and added, that Fakir Mohan is quite serious and quite conscious while he is writing a piece of literature, especially when we are talking about a piece like Chauman Athagund. Similarly, I would extend the thankfulness to Dr. Rabindra Kumar Das, uh, who introduced and managed this webinar. I would thank the president of today's webinar and the managing trustee, Professor Dr. Monica Das, Madam. Of course, to the chief speaker, Professor Satya Mohanty Bhai, is 2 years ago in 2020, I had a conversation with Professor Mohanty, and when I called him sir, he told that in Odisha we call Bhai. And from that conversation, I believed, and that today, with a great presentation, I shared the knowledge. Uh, Today I got to know that how beautiful personality he has, and really I'm thankful to sir. And in the question answer session, Hiranmoy Madam has really coordinated very well. Professor Rabinarayan Das, Professor Dr. Subhash Chandra Patra, and Professor Dipti Ranjan Patnaik have added really beautiful points, and they have made really this seminar, this webinar, a successful one. So I think I am very much thankful to him. I especially extend the thanking note to Professor Dr. Pati, Associate Professor of Allahabad University. We are proud of him, and I'm extending the thankfulness to one and all, every audience, every technical persons who have supported, who were present over here, and who have made this webinar successful. And last but not the least, I must thank to the beautiful voice who is present over here, Anandita Madam, who will really make it. She will give a new light to this webinar at the end of this. And thank you all once again. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
We'll have a tuneful ending to the session, of course, with Abhindita's songs. But before that, let's finish off with the whole session. So your vote of thanks is over, or you want to say something more?
Yes, ma'am, it's over.
So can I speak for a few minutes?
Yes.
Yeah.
Most certainly.
So Professor Mohanty held us in a spell, absolutely. And his discourse was nothing short of illuminating, I should say. And the most important thing, the most interesting part is that all this time we've been intrigued by the word competent. Now, I think most people are clear about what he meant by the use of the word competent. Now, that is something interesting. That's something very, very noteworthy. He has introduced a new way of reading a book, referring to close, what he means by close reading. This is something very new to the readers, I think. Now we met, Professor Mohanty, I met Professor Mohanty in Delhi as he was referring to this conference that we had in Delhi University. And this is the second time I'm meeting him on the web. And I thank him again profusely for being here with us. All good things have to come to an end. And we were, as I said, we were spellbound. We were held in a spell by his beautiful discourse. In fact, I would rather like to mention here that had it not been for, Bolton, John Bolton and Professor Mohanty, that Fakir Mohan perhaps would be hibernating. He would just be limited to Odisha. Now, because of these two people, their contribution is immense, is huge. I mean, we can't thank him enough for the contribution, for this contribution of taking Fakirmohan Senapati to the world arena. So that is something very, very remarkable. His tenacity, the tenacious way in which he has, analyzed his writings, and the passion, the most important thing, the passion with which he's doing it. Of course, there are many other people like Himanshu Mahapatra, Devendra Das, Jatin Naik, and so many others. But
Dipti Ranjan Patnaik.
Dipti Ranjan Patnaik. And I, of course, have very limited knowledge, but then whatever I know of these scholars and researchers, I feel they are really passionate about Fakirmohan. I feel ashamed that why did I start on Fakirmohan that late? In fact, I started reading him when I started, teaching in Delhi University. During my college days, I had read him. And so I am really fascinated by the way they're so passionately, reading his works, doing research on him, analyzing his works. Now, as Professor Mohanty said, that it's the many layered thing in his writings that needs to be understood. That again is something very, very new. I mean, we have been reading him very superficially, but this layered thing that he had, he's devoting a whole lot of attention to that. The close reading, the respectful reading, as he terms it, is something noteworthy. So our foundation has been, our main focus is the youth. And this is, again, something which is doing for the youth. And I would request him to be associated with the foundation in some manner or the other. Basically, as I said, our focus is on the youth. So if we could do something more in, acquainting the youth with the social concerns. Basically, Fakirmohan was, to start with, his concern was he had social concerns. He wanted to reform society, and that is how he started writing. So if we could link literature with the social concerns to make it a better world, that would be a very useful thing to do. And I request on behalf of the foundation, Professor Mohanty and many other luminaries here to, guide us, to tell us how we can take it further in this direction. I thank everyone here, especially, of course, but Devashish Pati, in a very crisp manner, kind of, as he said, he wouldn't like to take up phrases. There's some noise coming again from somewhere. I think it's, yeah, that's better. So I thank once again everybody who's here with us today. And as we are waiting for a tuneful ending to the session, Anindita Das, who has been with us, and she has been doing a great service by the musical rendition of Fakir Mohan's poems. Of course, I had done it a few years back with the help of Pranab Patnaik and Om Prakash Mohanty and all these people. We had brought out some kind of musical rendition of his poems titled Mohana Murchana, which is available on YouTube. Then Anindita Das took it further. She took the songs from us, the poems from us, and she's doing a wonderful job of a musical rendition of Fakir Mohan's poems. So you would hear her now. And many, many thanks to everybody, especially to Professor Mohanty.
Anindita, can I just take 2 seconds before you begin? Because I know it'll be hard to follow your So I've been thinking about the suggestion about what to do with youth. And so I want to follow up on what I said earlier. And do this, you have the resources to do this because you're based there close to Odisha, and in Odisha in many cases. Take, say, 5 or 6 or 8 schools in different parts of Odisha, different regions. Have the teachers pick out students who are into theater, or they like to tell stories, meaning not every student is like that. And have them read and discuss just the first chapter of Chaman, just the first chapter, the one we talked about. Discuss it. What is going on? Who's this? Who's saying about what? I mean, they may read the whole novel, but then come back to the first chapter. And then have video or audio recordings. Audio ideally because you don't want them to feel self-conscious, but video if they don't feel self-conscious, of how within each group different students would read these lines. I think Fakir Mohan scholars and Fakir Mohan critics all over Odisha, this will be in Odia, it won't be the English translation, will have a lot to learn from how different people, young kids, 15 years old, something like that, in different regions, hear the voices and interpret the voices. Some of it will be like a textbook, because that's how we're taught, but some of it, real light will shine through in some others. And I think it'll be a really wonderful experience to be able to read. And then say, just read it the way you would talk to your grandmother. Now, don't read it the way you would talk to your teacher. But you're reading this, right? And why grandmother? Well, because that's at home. You don't really have a formal relationship with grandmother. Your grandmother loves you. You love your grandmother. But you can't show off and say, well, I know these big words. There aren't that many big words in the first chapter, and have them go, but it's not the first reading. They have to discuss it and so on. interpret, and then get to the reading. I would love to hear those voices, frankly. Just the oral sound of those voices, the accents and the way in which they play. And I have as I said earlier, I have a feeling that we would learn a lot about what kinds of things young people are picking up, and also from different regions. What would somebody from Balasore, a young kid, pick up, and what would somebody from, I don't know, Koraput pick up? So anyway, what about the fact?
Thank you. We'll take more guidance from you and see how we can.
Just something to think about. Yeah, something to think about. The only other thing before we go to the song is, don't ever forget that this is a man, great writer or not, he was passionate about introducing Kobe. Remember, he writes about that. In other words, he was a practical reformer. Yes, literature, but he didn't see himself primarily as doing that. He did all kinds of things. He's just creative.
All kinds of things, yeah.
What I wasn't able to figure out is what kind of Kobe it is. Is it Fulgobi or Banda Kobe? It's probably Fulgobi, right? Banda Kobe is more traditional.
Yeah. I think we made a passing reference to it in my film, Anweshan. I don't know whether you've seen that. Have you heard of it? Oh, then you need to see that. It's on YouTube. Anweshan, which won the Best Docudrama Award, National Award. And it's been more than 12 years now that the film was made. And Doordarshan has the recording of it, has the CDs, in fact. And those 200 CDs were sold in the US by Doordarshan. And you can watch it on YouTube. It's called Anweshan. And we've discovered various facets of his character. And it's a docudrama, so part documentation part, and 3 hours, 3 hour duration. Of course, we sat with Namvar Singh and Mrinalini, who's the director of the archives, Doordarshan Archives, sponsored by Doordarshan Archives. We sat and we have edited it to 1 hour duration, which is more, user-friendly kind of. So I would like to have your comments on the film, and we'll be in touch. Thank you once again.
So now for the real joy of listening to Anindita Das.
Tuneful ending with Anindita Das. She's now in Bahrain, by the way.
Unmute karantu, mute achi.
नमस्कार सत्य भाई एवं समस्त को नमस्कार जनाउछि मु बाहरिन रे अछि एवं मिडल ईस्ट रे विशेष करी एबे मु फकीरमोहन को संगीत ही मु प्रचार करूछि काना मु बहुत प्रभावित मु आगरु बहुत गाइछि अलगा गीत किंतु तांकर लेखा मनिका पंगटु पाइला परे मु तांकर गीत पिला मानक पई जोटा अछि समाज पई जोटा अछि विधवा पई जोटा अछि हिंदू नारी रो बाहा हेई के आसुछि सेटा कोन अछि सेही परी बहुत बहुत संगीत को मो प्राय 40 टा गीत को पर्यंत करि पारिछि ताको कंपोज करी कि रेकॉर्ड करि पारिछि एवं बाहरिन रे जेहेतु अरब देशर अछि मु तांकर गीत गोटे गाउछि जे मरुभूमि एवं मरुभूमि को से केमती मनीष संगे समान करी कि से केमती कहिचंती जे सेटा को ही मु सुनाउछि देखी नाही मरुभूमि सुनियाछि नाम देखी नाही मरुभूमि सुनियाछि नाम उत्तप्त बालुका राशि अग्निमय धाम बिस्तारी बसिछि जहि जाल विभीषिका बिस्तारी बसिछि जहि जाल विभीषिका जीवन घातिनी मायाबिनी मरीचिका मायाबिनी मरीचिका मायाबिनी मरीचिका देखी नाही मरुभूमि सुनियाछि नाम উত্তপ্ত বালুকারাশি অগ্নিময় ধাম বিস্তারি বসিছি যাহি জল বিভীষিকা জীবন ঘাতিনি মায়াবিনী মরিচিকা মায়াবিনী মরিচিকা মায়াবিনী মরিচিকা পিপাসারে ছটপট ହେଉଛନ୍ତି ପ୍ରାଣୀ ମାତ୍ର ପିଇବାକୁ ମିଳେ ନାହିଁ ଟୋପେ ପାଣି ପିପାସାରେ ଛଟପଟ ହେଉଥାନ୍ତି ପ୍ରାଣୀ ମାତ୍ର ପିଇବାକୁ ମିଳେ ନାହିଁ ଟୋପେ ପାଣି ସନ ସନ ବହି ଆସେ ତତଲା ପବନ ସନ ସନ ବହି ଆସେ ତତଲା ପବନ ଉଡ଼ାଇ ନେବାକୁ ଯେହ୍ନେ ପ୍ରାଣୀଙ୍କ ଜୀବନ ପ୍ରାଣୀଙ୍କ ଜୀବନ ପ୍ରାଣୀଙ୍କ ଜୀବନ ପ୍ରାଣୀଙ୍କ ଜୀବନ ପ୍ରାଣୀଙ୍କ ଜୀବନ ନିରାଶ ହୃଦୟଟି ମରୁମୟ ଦେଶ ତୁଳନା ହେ ନାହିଁ କିଛି ଇତର ବିଶେଷ ନିରାଶ ହୃଦୟଟି ମରୁମୟ ଦେଶ ତୁଳନାରେ ନାହିଁ କିଛି ଇତର ବିଶେଷ କାମ କ୍ରୋଧ ତପ୍ତ ବୋଲି ଗର୍ବର ବିକର କାମ କ୍ରୋଧ ତପ୍ତ ବୋଲି ଗର୍ବର ବିକର ନିତ୍ୟ ଦିବ୍ୟମାନ ଦେଖ ହିଂସା ବିଭୀଷିକା ହିଂସା ବିଭୀଷିକା হিংসা বিভীষিকা হিংসা বিভীষিকা হিংসা বিভীষিকা দেখি নাহি মরুভূমি শুনিয়াছি নাম উত্তপ্ত বালুকারাশি অগ্নিময় ধাম বিস্তারি বসিছি যাহি জল বিভীষিকা জীবন ঘাতিনি মায়াবিনী মরিচিকা মায়াবিনী মরিচিকা মায়াবিনী মরিচিকা
साधु 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 बहुत सुंदर
धन्यवाद
मैडम ये समाप्ति घोषणा करंतु बंद कर देबा अनम्यूट करो अनम्यूट
मैडम म्यूट अछंती टिके ऑन कर दियंतु
हां समस्त को पुणी थरे अनेक धन्यवाद विशेष करी प्रोफेसर महांती को विशेष धन्यवाद समस्त को बहुत बहुत भल लागिला समस्त एकाठी हेले डिस्कशन बहुत भल रे चलीला हम संगे जोड़ी हे कि रुहंतु ए कामना करूची नमस्कार।